question is, are the characters of the Torah literal, or are they metaphorical embodiments of certain qualities?
So the question is, are the characters of the Torah literal? Means do they actually happen?
I guess maybe.
Yeah. Do they literally be there?
Were
they real people?
Or did they just represent certain archetypal figures?
So the short answer is that it's both literal and they're archetypes. They're embodiment of qualities and also literal people. We have to understand this, but it's important to understand this. I don't want to say attention, because it doesn't have to be attention, but to hold these two constructs very strongly of a literal understanding that there's, like we're reading these week's parshas, learning about Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov. These are literal people that walked the earth, that that were born from parents, died, had physical lives, and yet they're archetypes and they're embodiments of qualities on a very large scheme. Their embodiment of like the whole history of Klal Yisrael. The whole history of the people of Israel is all embodied within the characters of the Torah. This idea of Ma'aseh V'Sim L'Banim, that the works, the actions of our ancestors becomes a guiding indication for their children, for their descendants. And we can look at them. We can even look at, like, for example, the Maral looks at this way, that you can look at the three patriarchs of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov as different time periods in Jewish history. Like before Matan Torah would be Avram, which is Chesed, time of kindness, 26 generations of Chesed, and then of this kindness, no action based. And then the second generation is Avodah, which is Yitzchak, the idea of service, and then the idea of carbon, of offerings. And then after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, of the temples, is the idea of Torah, the rise of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is Yaakov. So they could be seen as that way. But then much more importantly, they also have to be seen as characters within ourselves. That they're all represents different characters. And many Hasidic Svarim speak about this idea that every biblical character, every Torah character we have in the Torah, represents a certain quality within us. There's like the little Moshe, which is the Redeemer, or the Das, awareness, consciousness, the one that's aware, versus the Pharaoh, which is the idea of restriction and ego and something that's stuck. And they're all inner characters within ourselves to understand our own processes and our own development and how we reach freedom, how we reach clarity. The Torah is giving us indications of these characters that become archetypes and embodiment of certain qualities. So the Zohar says that that if you read the Torah and you only understand the Torah on a pshat level, on a literal level, then that isn't literally, that's the depth of the text, is literally what you see, then you're a fool. If you read it and you only read it as metaphor, and that it represents archetypes and things like that, then you're a heretic. So there's a balance between that, between these two ideas. The Chidah brings down this idea that the word pardes, which represents the four levels of interpretation of the Torah, from pardes, from the level of pshat to the level of side, of the deeper understanding, and the side side, which is even higher, the fifth level. But the four levels of understanding of the interpretive explanation of the Torah is that pshat rebens drush without is parad, is separation. If you don't have the side, you're nifrad, you have separation. So we have to create some type of comprehensive understanding, much like all of life, but a comprehensive understanding, a holistic understanding of everything as all parts of a literal and a both metaphorical. Historically, if you look after the conclusion of the Talmud, this is really, you'll see how this is related to the Torah itself. But after the conclusion of the Talmud, which is roughly in the 5th, 6th century in Babylonia, which is Iraq, present-day Iraq, there was an understanding that in the Gemara itself, the Talmud, which is the Gemara, is that there were two parts of the Gemara. There were two parts. One was the law, and one was the lore, like the legends. One was the Agadata, the stories of the Talmud, the legends of the Talmud, the stories of the Talmud. Legend sounds like they're, and then there was the practice of the law, of how you actually implement law, and the Talmudic debates about that. So, and in general, this is generally called also Midrash. This is called Midrash. So Midrash itself, there is what we know, what we more commonly know, which is the Midrash Rabbah, which is a commentary on the Torah, which is more midrashic, which is more Agadata, more legends, more stories, and Midrash Tanchuma. But there's, which is also a Midrash in that time period. These Midrash is very old. These Midrashim date back even before the end of the Talmud. This is like dating from the post time of the Mishnayos, even the times of the Mishnayos. So it's about 2,500 years ago. Parallel to that, there was also Midrash Halacha. There were Midrashim that the Gemara calls in the Dharam Lamed Hey, the Gemara, Rosh and Tosfos say that it's called Midrash HaPsukim, like the Midrash on the verses, which is like Sifra, Sifri, Teres Kainim. These are parallel to Talmudic discussions or Mishnayos discussions, which is law, pure law, very, very little narrative, very little story. But then there's Midrash itself, which is the more popular version of that. And the question is, what do we do with that? We know Midrash. We know we don't learn law from Midrash. But what do we do with all the story? Like, Pare, the Gemara says, is, Amma, he was a foot tall. And what does that mean? Is it literal, and how are you supposed to understand this? So in the early time period of the Goinim, like Shmuel Chafne Goin, some other Goinim said, we don't really know what this is, and don't pay too much attention to it, because we actually don't know what these stories are. In the time of the Rambam, so the Rambam is about from 1135 to 1205, around that century, 1100s, 12th century. So the Rambam wrote on the Midrash and on the Gemara, in Mishnayos and other places. The Rambam wrote about these Midrashim, and the way the Rambam understood the Midrash was that they're deep metaphors. That sometimes you want to speak and you want to impart a certain type of information. So the best way to do it sometimes is to give it over in a story. So instead of telling you directly what this deep wisdom that I'm trying to impart to you, I'll give you over a story. The story you will remember. I'm going to explain you what the story means, and there you'll have the story, and that will allow you to retain this information. That was a way to transmit this type of information. So the idea of Midrash was understood as metaphor, generally, and a little bit philosophical, more like the Rambam style, more Aristotelian, but understanding like there's different levels in the nefesh, within consciousness, and always the mind has to control the seichel. These are the conversations that the Rambam would read into Midrash. It's interesting that in the same time period, there's a letter I just recently saw from Rav Zriel of Gerona, which is a student of Rabbi Yitzchak Saginar, Isaac the Blind, who is a son of the Ravid. The Ravid was a contemporary. The Ravid was in Provence. The Ravid was a contemporary of the Rambam, and he's the Rambam's great, the person that argues tremendously with the Rambam in the halacha. His son was a great Kabbalist, great Mekubal, Yitzchak Saginar, and one of his students, Rabbi Zriel and Rabbi Zariah, were the Rebbes of the Ramban of Nachmanides. And he wrote a letter saying that the Soidas HaTorah, the secrets of the Torah, the transmission of the inner aspects of the Torah, the spiritual aspects of the Torah, was really encoded within Agadata, within these legends. It's not just a philosophical understanding of what these midrashim were, a metaphorical understanding in terms of a philosophical understanding, but the deep secrets of the Torah were actually hidden into these midrash. There is much later on, the Ramchal writes this in his defense of Agadata. He writes this idea, and the Alter Rebbe actually writes a similar idea when he says Roiv Soides HaTorah Gnuzim Ba. When he speaks about Agadata and Yaakov, he says that most of the great secrets of the Torah is hidden there. This is another way of understanding it. But let's go back to the Rambams, which is metaphor. I'll explain you why I'm telling you this whole thing. The Rambam lived originally in Spain, right? And eventually he was driven out by the Almohads, and he had to leave, and he went to Egypt. At some time period, when the Rambam started publishing his Yala Chazaka, which is his book of law, he became familiar with a group of scholars, great tremendous scholars that lived in Provence, which is today sort of the south of Spain. I'm sorry, south of France. It wasn't in France. That was not. There was Chachmet Sarfas. There were the sages of the French scholars, like Michiel of Paris and Maram Rutenberg, and the Roche was their student. That was in France. That was near Paris. This is more in the south, in the south of Spain, in the south of on the Mediterranean, in that area, the Provence. There was great scholars there. There was great scholars. Lunil, Chacham Lunil, Rabbi Yonasan of Lunil, the Meiri, Rav Roman Har. There was many great scholars there. And the Rambam started corresponding with these Chachmei Lunil, with the wise people of the Nil of Provence, in Halacha, in the world of Halacha. They were reading his farm, they were reading his books on Halacha. And the Rambam was very impressed with them, by the way, in terms of their halachic scholarship and Talmudic scholarship. He said that he writes in a letter that he can die now that he knows that there's such great scholars in this world that will hold up the Torah, because he didn't really hold up the scholars that still existed in Babylon, and those scholars he didn't think they were up to par. But they start asking him if he has any other text, and he sends them. The Rambam sends him Sefer Amada, which is the first book of the Yad HaChazaka, of his major work on Halacha, and he sends them also the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed. Now these texts, especially the guide, and the Pirush Mishnayos, the writings of the Rambam Mishnayos, were written in Arabic. No, they're written in Hebrew letters, but in Arabic. They were in Arabic, but with Hebrew letters, because they're written in Spain. And the scholars that lived there, like Rabbi Yonasan and the Balamar, all these great scholars that lived there, didn't speak Arabic. So it's interesting that there was two families that came from Spain and ended up living in Provence. One was the Ibn Tobin family, Yud Ibn Tobin, Shmuel Ibn Tobin, the son, and Anatolio, Yaakov Anatolio, his brother-in-law. And one was the Kimchi family, Yosef Kimchi, and then his son, Reb David Kimchi, is the Radak. That's a very famous scholar that lived at that time, wrote on the whole Tanakh. So they started translating the Rambam's text, especially the Moreh Nevuchim, and also Munah V'Deis, many texts, many philosophical texts that came out of Spain, the Kuzari, and many of these texts that were written in Arabic. They started these families, the Ibn Tuma family, started translating them into Hebrew, and it became very popular. What happened was something very interesting, and what happened was that the Rambam, let's go back to the Rambam's understanding of Midrash. The Rambam's understanding of Midrash was that it's metaphorical, that all these legends and all these characters that start when the sages are talking about, this large fish that took up, hundreds of tens of miles, or, all these fantastical stories, they're metaphor. Okay. Over a short period of time, people started reading this and said, so now maybe we can back that into the Torah. If we're doing that with the Talmud already, we can start doing that with the Torah. So Moshe represents something, and Avram represents something, and Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, represents an idea, and going out of Egypt represents an idea. They're all metaphors. And once you opened up this idea that it's a possibility that these fantastical stories in the Talmud are not actual miraculous stories or actual events, but metaphor, some started reinterpreting that, and that became heresy, obviously, reinterpreting that and saying that that's what the Torah is talking about. When the Torah talks about the splitting of the sea, we're not actually talking about the splitting of the sea. We're talking about the metaphor of that. This became a great controversy So much so that, unfortunately, Rabbeinu Yoina, who was was connected with Bazil and Azariah, and Ramban was also his mechut, and their children married each other. Rabbeinu Yoina actually spearheaded this idea with Ramban Ahar. They spearheaded to burn publicly the Rambam's Mar Nevuchim, the Guide to Perplexed, and Sefer Hamada, and these books, and we know what happened. I mean, what do you mean they didn't burn themselves? They spoke to they got the church involved, and the church was very happy to burn Jewish books, and eventually, unfortunately, just a few years later, they burned the Talmud, famously in France, and the scholars then realized that they took it too far, so they backed down. But at that point, there was a lot of pressure put on the Rashba, Shalom Ben Aders, who was then the rabbi, who was a student of Rabbeinu Yonah and a student of the Ramban. There was a lot of pressure and he was the Gadol Yisrael at that time. He was the greatest sage, that he should put a ban on, and that's what he did. Eventually, he wrote a ban against learning philosophy up until a certain age, and like in 1305, and he passed away a few years later. Before he passed away, he wrote this ban reluctantly, but he did write this ban against learning philosophy. But what's fascinating is, and this is why I'm telling you this whole story, is in the tshuva to the Ramban by Daya Pnini, in the tshuva the Rambam writes the response to the Ramban, the Rashba writes about the issue of philosophy. He says that they show him that one of the things that they're saying is that, for example, when it says Vatama Sarah, that when it says that Sarah passed away, Bikiras Arba, in the place of 4, He Chevron, that's the place of Chevron. Sarah, Avram represents the soul. Sarah represents the body. So what it means is that the body dies, returns back to the 4 elements: fire, wind, earth, and water. And that's Chevron, that's the place of Chibur, that's the place of unification, and the body returns to the earth. So when he talks about that Sarah dies, it represents the concept that the body eventually dies and returns back to the earth. This is one of the problems that he writes. But what's really fascinating is this was against philosophy, not to learn philosophy. Look what can happen. Look how you can read the pasuk. You can read a verse in the Torah that speaks about Sarah, a literal person, and say that it represents something. A very short time after this, the Zohar became revealed, and students of the Ramban, or Yitzchak Diminako, others already tried to see the manuscripts of the Zohar, but the Zohar became revealed. And in Chayesar, in the portion of Chayesar, the Zohar writes us. The Zohar actually, it's not quoting from the philosophers, the Zohar says its own thing. And it says, yeah, that's Avram is the neshama, and Sarah is the soul, and Vatama Sarah, Sarah passes away in Chevron, that represents the body returning to its elements. So what's the difference? This is the major difference. The difference is, you read the story as a literal story, and it also imparts a wisdom, a metaphor, an embodiment of a certain type of quality. It's also an archetype. The moment you separate the two, that's the idea of periods. And from the deepest level, if you can really understand this, the Reb Chaim Vital writes this in in one of his more cryptic texts. Reb Chaim Vital writes a lot of cryptic texts, but this is really a dense text. Reb Chaim, who's a student of the Ari, that the oimek of pshat is the oimek hasoid. The depth of pshat is the depth of the secret. Or to say it differently, the highest secret is that there's no secret. But if you can see that, if you're not to learn the Torah in a correct way, you'll be able to see that the more you understand the pshat, the more the pshat becomes literal and becomes revealed to you, the more it's actually a literal story about a literal person. And the more literal it becomes, the more it helps you to unlock the deepest mystery. And that's really something that we usually think are contradictory to each other, because we think that either it's going to be the metaphor or it's going to be the literal. And the literal is like very dry and boring, and the metaphor is so rich and imaginative. But the truth is that if you understand the depth of that the Torah is actually a chativa achas. The Torah is one it's a Torah. It's one unit. It's one entity. It has to be. It comes from Hashem Echad. It's one. It comes from a place of one is one. It's always one. So if you understand that, you can try to unpeel the depth of the shot, and through that reveal the highest levels of the secrets. And the short answer to your question is, it's both, always.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Our next question.
That's it. That's it. Okay.
Well.
All right. Fine. I'm ready to move. I'm ready to move on.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if it was.
No, go ahead. Just tell me the question. Yeah.
Totally. Well, my question is with this literal dimension to the Torah and the metaphorical dimension to the Torah.
Yeah.
Could we also see our lives in such a way that there's kind of a literal dimension that we kind of see, and there's like this normal surface layer of life, but there's also deeper layers that we can understand ourselves and the goings on simultaneously.
Of course. The Torah's Adam. The Torah's Adam is the Torah of man, and the whole world is a roshim of the Torah, which means it's an imprint of the Torah. Of course, that's how we understand ourselves. That we have our literal life, and we're living literally in this world, and we have physical bodies and represent something physically, but we're also represent something to ourselves, to others, certainly to our family, and maybe even to larger people. There's multiple levels of self in the expression of self, and this is where I think it becomes the same idea like with the Torah, is that the more pshat you are, and in the interpretation of that would mean the more literal you are, that's the greater secret that you're revealing. Because sometimes people feel that people try to project a mystery to make themselves interesting, or you are or you're not. But the point is that the more real you are, the more mysterious you actually are. The more the metaphor is. The more shot you are, the more soid you are. We have to think about this, because I think this is mamish the truth the way we are.
The more present you are.
Yes.
The more haya you need.
Exactly. The more present you are, the more you are. And we shouldn't get caught up in the superficiality. The superficiality is like the muscle. You think, if you... Let me give you a different type of example of this, but let's say there's a certain persona that you have to hold up to be a certain person. Let's say you're a musician. So you have to hold up the persona of being a musician, because people want to see you not as almost as a person, but as a personification of an idea, what they think of you. And sometimes a person can get caught up in the persona of that they start thinking that's who they are. And the moment they start thinking that's who they are, they lose their mystery. And the only way that they maintain their mystery, or they maintain their innerness, their primus, is if they're always real. And whatever their real means. And that's the pshat, to be in the pshat level, to be in the literal level.